everyone, and welcome to our panel. My name is Malu Gracia. I'm a member of the Nexus marketing team and your moderator for today's panel session. Our topic today is Our Mission, Our Message Marketing Your Nonprofit. Really looking forward to this conversation, but as usual, before we jump in, I do have some quick logistics to cover. NXUnite is made in partnership with Nexus Marketing. The NXUnite mission is to make introductions that lead to lasting relationships and serve as a hub for connection in the mission driven sector. As you saw in our video, on NXUnite, you can find upcoming industry events, suggested influencers to follow, trusted solutions, cost driven podcasts, and of course, panels with experts such as these lovely folks with me here today. Today's hour long panel will include time both for questions curated by my team and questions from you all, our lovely audience. At any time during the panel, please feel free to submit your questions via the questions tab. We already have a few questions via registration, but we will give priority to our live audience members. So feel free to submit your questions at any time during the session, and we'll get to as many as possible during the second half. Now, if at any point you're having any technical difficulties, my colleague Anton will be in the chat as the Team NX Unite username ready to assist you the best he can. I also wanted to share that this panel is being recorded. So, for those of you watching live, the recording will be sent to you via email after the session ends. People can also continue to register for this panel. So, if you have any friends in the industry you want to share this panel with, simply send them the same registration page and they can access the recording. Finally, before I introduce today's panelists, I do want to thank you all for attending this panel. Whether you're joining us live, watching the recording tomorrow, a month from now, or a year from now, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us to learn from these outstanding experts who I will now finally introduce. So I'd like to first introduce Carly Euler, who is the marketing manager at MemoryFox, where she values the opportunity to elevate hundreds of nonprofits' missions. She has held positions at the Wiley Network, Breast Cancer Coalition, Code of Support Foundation, Kenya Lacrosse Association, and the BOMA Project, where she has specialized in marketing, special events, communications, and fundraising. Storytelling has been an integral part of each role. Carly currently lives in Rochester, New York with her husband and rescue dog, Sadie. Great to have you, Carly.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Also with us today is Daria Hall, who is the Executive Vice President in the Washington, D.C. office of Fenton. Bringing more than 15 years of experience to her position, Daria works collaboratively with senior leadership across the firm, plays a pivotal role in the new business activities, and provides day to day oversight of accounts as well as high level strategic counsel to Fenton clients. Glad to have you, Daria.
Thanks, Malu. Great to be here.
Of course. Also with us today is Farah Trompeter, who is the co-director and member owner at Big Duck, a worker-owned cooperative that builds strong brands, campaigns, and teams for nonprofit organizations, foundations, and government agencies. Farah directs Big Duck's marketing and business development efforts, seeking to build relationships with nonprofits who want to use communication to achieve their mission. Farah has led dozens of organizations through major brand overhauls, fundraising campaigns, and much more since joining Big Duck in 2007. Glad to have you, Farah.
Great to be here.
Wonderful. And finally, with us today is Ariana Aragon, who is the Senior Director of Services at Feather. She has a proven track record of supporting nonprofits with strategic digital advertising, creative prowess, and entrepreneurial flair. In 2017, she has founded Springful, a digital ad agency which was acquired by Feather in 2019. Ariana oversees Feather's in house services team, which has successfully fulfilled over 4,000 marketing campaigns. She has launched her career at an early stage tech startup in Gainesville and has been involved in the city's budding startup community since. Great to have you, Ariana.
Excited to be here. Thank you.
Of course. Now it's finally time to hear from our panelists. And Carly, I'll have you start us off with the first question. How are best practices related to nonprofit marketing and messaging different today in comparison to a few years ago?
Sure, I'm happy to start. I would say that one huge shift that we are all seeing right now in terms of marketing and messaging is the shift of everyone needing to have an authentic voice for their organization. Um, Even just a few years ago, everybody was still writing emails that were from the company, and every social post was like so formal, like double, triple checked for all the possible grammar issues. And I think we all have kind of agreed like that stuff's kind of boring. So, and I'm sorry if that sounds like your organization, but maybe people might not be reading your emails as much. So I just think that we are seeing a huge shift of people who, because of the how crazy all of our attention is being drawn in 100 directions all the time, that people are just dying to see some personality, especially from the people behind the scenes at the organization that are doing all the really good work. So, and for us, we just know that the most effective way to do that is through video storytelling.
I would love to jump in and build on what Carly shared. Totally agree. Carly, I think the practices of creating and developing messaging content, right? Like, identifying audiences, interviewing key stakeholders, developing language that will resonate with the people you're trying to reach to convey in a clear, concise message. Like that process hasn't really changed, but the tools and platforms with which we share these messages have definitely changed due to the digital age, due to COVID, due to the political environment we find ourselves in, right? So at Fenton, we're looking into different platforms and tools and how they've evolved over time. Chat GPT, right? AI powered chat bots is a new thing that's coming into our sector. The evolution of TikTok is another big thing. Carly was talking about storytelling and thinking about all the different ways that we tell stories nowadays, right? Even virtual reality as a service is something that more and more organizations and agencies are taking closer consideration of. And then there's, of course, streaming platforms like Roku and Pluto TV, right? Because audiences are shifting where they consume media. It's just another sort of, I think, part of the digital toolbox that we see expanding and growing in our current climate.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for starting us off, Carly and Daria. And Farah, over to you. What has changed in terms of best practices in the recent years?
Well, Carly and Daria spoke to a lot of the points I was going to make. I would say, just building off one of the things Daria said, I think there are a lot more tools available to us. And I think those tools allow us to create more customized and segmented communications and be more sophisticated. And our users, including nonprofit participants, donors, activists, are expecting that. So if you're not doing more personalized or customized communications in terms of using names or past behavior patterns or even methods of delivery, then I think people are starting to fall off. The other thing I would just raise up is that I think now there's also a more active questioning of quote unquote best practices. Who set those best practices? Who were those best practices for? Are they really best practices? What's the difference between doing what we know works versus doing what we know is right? And I think as organizations are centering diversity, equity, and inclusion more in their work, there is that more active questioning of just because we did it this way or we were told for many years this is quote unquote how it's done, should we keep doing it? So I would say that is certainly coming alive a lot more too.
Thanks, Farah. Ariana, anything you want to add to this conversation and changes on the best practices in nonprofit marketing and messaging?
Yeah, I would echo Farah in terms of, I think benchmarking comes up all the time for our customers as everyone wants benchmarks and what are the industry best practices? What are the best practices and benchmarks and what is good for nonprofits? And what we're seeing increasingly is that benchmarks are all over the place depending on what stage you are in your marketing journey as an organization, and being able to have enough data to benchmark against yourself is the most valuable, and year over year trying to improve in different ways with more segmentation and personalization can actually be a more accurate and helpful metric of success than going off of some arbitrary, Google search or chat GPT spit out of what you should be doing. And then that's where alignment can come in too, around values and being able to really connect with the audience that you want instead of just trying to hit a number.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ariana. All right, we're off to a great start. And Daria, I'll have you start us off with the next question. What are some key elements of successful nonprofit messaging, and how can organizations ensure that their messaging resonates with their target audience?
It's a really great question. I think when you're thinking about messaging, you have to first start with your audience. Who are you speaking to? Who are the key stakeholders that you need to communicate with? And what are the different words, because word choice matters, right? That you need to use to get people to really lean in. And so I think the first step is always identifying your audience and being really, really clear on who your priorities are and who may come in as a secondary audience, right? For nonprofits, it's often going to be other practitioners in your sector, funders, right? It may be the community service, the community members in your service areas, right? So identify exactly who you need to speak to in order to do your work and to have some level of success is the first step. And then I always say that taking a values approach to messaging is always a good template for a framework, right? You start with your values, right? These are big overarching values that it's hard for people to argue with, right? Like, every child deserves access to a free and fair education, right? Getting really clear about what your organizational values are. Second is naming the challenge. If you were coming up with a messaging framework for your organization, you have to name the challenge that your organization exists to solve or work toward closing the gap around. So name the challenge. The third would just be thinking of solutions. What are the solutions that your organization is bringing to the table, right? And then the fourth would be the actions or ask. What are you asking of your audiences? So that to me is a pretty standard basic messaging framework that any organization can take and run with.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Daria. Farah, over to you. What makes messaging effective, and how to ensure that it connects with the intended audience?
Yeah, I would say, the first thing, if you have the time and ability, is to start with some research, really understand, as Daria said, not just being clear on who your audiences are, but also if you can deepen your understanding of what motivates them, what is likely, to get them to act, what they see as the challenge and the solution, who else they might support or go to if you offer services, or who else they might engage with if you're an advocacy organization. Really understand what motivates them, what their perceptions are of you or the issue or the movement that you're part of, and really understanding where you fit in the ecosystem, both from their perspective and your perspective. And from there, if you can continue to go back to that audience to test the messages, to see what their feedback is, and keep refining it. Messaging should be alive. A lot of organizations will go through at Big Duck, we do a lot of branding work. We do messaging as part of our work around the overall organization. You might go through that process once every 5-10 years. That doesn't mean you shouldn't be updating your messaging every year or more frequently than that. And there's a difference between organizational messaging, messaging for the press around certain positions, or what we call persuasive messaging, which is messaging to get a particular audience to take a particular action, whether that's donating to you, signing up with you, taking action with you. I'll share an article in the chat that we wrote about that difference. But I think really understanding who you're trying to reach, what you want them to do, and what's the best way to explain what you're about in the way that they will understand. The other piece I'll say is that we read a blog post years ago that said, messaging is not for the executive director. I think a lot of times the executive director or CEO doesn't understand why you need to create a messaging document, because doesn't everyone know how to talk about our organization? The CEO or executive director certainly can talk about it in their sleep, and so can many of the other staff, but not everyone can, or they can really speak from the perspective of their program, but haven't been given the tools to speak about the entire organization at large. So I think really having effective messaging is thinking about how you can engage your staff throughout the process, make sure that they're not only trained, but that you're creating spaces for ongoing feedback and using that feedback from them to adapt the messaging.
Wonderful. Thanks, Farah. Ariana, same question over to you. What are the crucial components of an effective messaging?
I think when it comes to digital and that persuasive messaging, something that I see often overlooked as we're crafting campaigns for our customers is not running through the user experience for all of the different pathways that the user will go through. So whether it's an email or an ad, if you're landing on a page, you want that page to resonate with the user, with that identified segment. You also want that page to keep the thread of the message that was in that email that they clicked on or the ad that they clicked on. You want, the call to action to be front and center. And often I see landing pages have, it's easy to get lost in them, or you don't know as a user what to do next. And so something I always say to my team is the first step, if we're seeing drop off, a lot of users dropping off pages, is we are all donors of different types and we are engaged in different causes. Like, be in that seat from that perspective. What would you do if you went to this page, and what is confusing about this page? And often we see that it's optimizing the landing pages that gives us the biggest lift versus trying to over optimize like campaign targeting. So I think really empathizing with the user experience, I find, is very key to crafting the right message and making sure it's coherent along the entire journey.
Definitely. Carly, what would you like to add? What are some essential aspects of effective nonprofit messaging?
Yeah, I think everybody has made very, very good points. I'll just add that I think the storytelling aspect when it comes to messaging is super important, because a lot of times you see all these impact numbers, and those mean a lot to you if you work in programs and if you're the executive director, because you understand the impact you're having by the numbers. But a lot of times they can be hard for people to really think of in the entire, like, in comparison to the world. So when you have those storytelling aspects that really show the impact of the numbers, they give it context, that can just be really helpful. And I think it's very essential for people to do that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carly. Very quickly, I'd like to remind our live audience to start submitting your questions at any time so we can address the topics that are most relevant to you and your team. All right, here's our next question. And Farah, I'll have you start us off with this one. How can organizations ensure that their messaging is inclusive and effective?
Sorry, my computer got a little cranky there. So, that's a great question. And I think it in part comes back to one of the things Daria mentioned earlier in the last question about words. I think one of the first things you can do is ask, is your language accessible? Are we using plain language, or are we writing at a graduate school level? So first of all, can people actually understand what we're talking about? Certainly in some industries, there is jargon that makes sense to use. But for most of us, we may be trained to write grants. That's not the way our everyday messaging should be going out there, especially if we're trying to be inclusive. The other piece is a lot of organizations are creating what's called language guides, which is things like, instead of saying this phrase, say this phrase, based on what they know is really makes sense given their community and what needs to happen. Again, I would just say to the last point I made, I think this is where staff is really a valuable asset, where you can ask them and members of the community for feedback, really understanding how that message is resonating, how it may not be resonating, highlighting if anything is stigmatizing. And of course, if you do ask people with lived experience for feedback, making sure to compensate them for their time. So I think there are steps we can take to genuinely kind of represent that, and really thinking about this work as bottom up and community centered, as opposed to top down and really kept to just a few people.
Wonderful. Thanks, Farah. Ariana, on to you. Any insights on what organizations can do to make their messaging inclusive and impactful?
Yeah, I think I love what Farah said too about language guides of as we are evolving our messaging, making sure we are looking at all of the places our message is. And there could be some, we might have updated our homepage, but in the archives of our blog or in our impact stories, there is messaging that may feel outdated or not as inclusive. And so doing that audit, I think, is huge and really keeps that consistency across the organization. And then similarly, I think the storytelling and showing the impact stories and making them very human, where we're not making generalizations about entire groups, but instead sharing a specific real experience from a beneficiary or from the organization, I think really helps humanize it, personalize it, and I think it helps the audience connect with the story without trying to make broad, overarching statements.
Great insight. Carly, over to you. What steps can organizations take to ensure that their messaging is both inclusive and effective?
Yeah, I mean, exactly what Ariana said. We actually refer to stories that we collect from people as our community generated content instead of just user generated content, because it is directly from your community. It's their own story. And that is how you make it more inclusive, because you're giving them the microphone to tell their own story. And just by nature, it's more authentic and more personalized that way. And I just think like technology has been such a huge help in making sure that we can access those stories from people who maybe you weren't able to collect things from in the past. So that is, I really recommend that people take the use of technology, and hopefully they can use it to bring more inclusive stories to their mission. And then finally, I would just say that we're also seeing a shift where we're rethinking the way that we are telling stories and using trauma-informed storytelling in order to just make sure that we are emphasizing how much the person in the story, we're not trying to exploit their story. And I think a lot of times in the past, there has been a whole like, oh, let's just make it as emotional as possible. But you don't know the impact you might be having on that person when you are making them retell their story in that way. So I love that so many people in our space are now thinking more critically about trauma-informed storytelling, and therefore everybody is feeling a bit more comfortable sharing things that have happened to them because everyone's being more respectful.
Wonderful. Dario, we want to hear from you as well. What are your thoughts on how organizations can ensure that their messaging is effective and inclusive?
Yeah, I second everything that my fellow panelists have mentioned. Look, messaging is really hard, even for a seasoned writer or communicator. It's also a very iterative process, a lot of back and forth, and you have to allow time to do it well, right? And then to, I think, Farah's point, messaging also evolves over time, right? A big framework or point that we try to include in all of our message development projects is considering asset versus deficit framing, right? I think other panelists are speaking to this community-informed approach, right? And asset framing is defining people by their aspirations and their contributions, rather than acknowledging the challenges that often extend, beyond them. And I think, when you look at your organization's mission and value statements, sometimes we include language that can be and feel exclusive to some communities. An example, we help at-risk youth in high crime neighborhoods, right? That is something, and this is, I pulled from a source that I reference quite often, but, there are tons of sort of deficit language in there that might exclude or trigger certain communities you're trying to reach, right? An asset framing approach might mean or read, we help young people overcome obstacles and achieve their dreams, right? So it really it requires a level of authenticity, some thoughtfulness and time to do it right and to pick the right words that will get people to lean in instead of push away.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Daria. Ariana, here's our next question. Nonprofit professionals are very busy. What small change to current marketing practices could they make that potentially could have a big impact?
I love this question. I think number one thing that we recommend, especially to our smaller nonprofits who are just starting and looking for, a gateway to doing more strategic automated marketing, is getting a grip on your analytics and understanding what your audience is doing on your website and how they are engaging with your content. And if you're just throwing messages out there and you're unable to analyze or understand the impact of those messages, that's where you can end up spinning your wheels or wasting resources. And so even if it's a starting place of getting a tracking code on every page of your website and building some initial segments and seeing how those assumptions of who your audience is, how true those are. If you grouped your audience into 4 different buckets, does your campaign data and your website data actually prove that those are your 4 buckets, or they're actually 2 different buckets? So starting to get the analytics that you need to understand your community in more depth is first point, and it can take a year sometimes to really get that going and get that ramped up, and that's okay. But without having that grasp, then you're just throwing money and time potentially in an ineffective direction.
Thanks, Ariana. Carly, over to you. Any advice on small changes nonprofits can make today that will have a big impact?
Yeah, I agree with Ariana, especially about the saving time, starting to get a grip on your analytics and just like really focusing more on those. I'll just say that like a few years ago, in terms of like social media messaging specifically, there used to be all these rules. Like if you just posted consistently or early in the morning, you would gain followers and you would gain engagement. Like those were hard and fast rules that a lot of us did. But those really aren't so true anymore. And if you are still holding yourself to those old standards and expecting the same results, just know that it's not you, it is the algorithm, and please give yourself a break and maybe start trying to rethink of the way that you see those channels, because they're changing. So I actually just heard Dana Snyder talk about this topic, and it was just so interesting, where she basically said like, hey, maybe it's time to reconsider how many channels you spend so much of your time, stress, energy on, and really think about which ones. Either she had 2 points. One, a platform that you spend time on should either be where's your time best spent, or where do you find the most joy? Because one or the other is going to make sure that you get the most out of actually spending that time on it.
Wonderful. Dario, what small changes to current marketing practices will potentially have a big impact?
So, my comment may be a little controversial, but during my time in house, there's often sometimes a bit of a tug of war between the communications team and the program team. And I think that the more those 2 departments can work better together, bringing in comms from the start in the communications process, in the grant making process, in the grant proposal process, I think alleviates a lot of challenges that come after, when comms folks are sort of don't have a seat at the table from the start. So I'm always really big on making sure communications is part of the entire proposal process from the very beginning, because essentially both departments really, really need each other, right? One is where you draw the content and the experts from, and comms is, there's a force that helps to amplify. And so I think one thing I've learned over the years is just making sure comms has a seat at the table from the very beginning. And then also, I think something to keep in mind is to utilize your own channels. Right? We often talk about everything outside of the organization that can be used, but your own channels are an important part of your integrated approach, right, to communications. And so your website, your social media platforms, even if you are still creating blogs or doing different email blasts on different topics and issues, being thoughtful and strategic about how you use your own media channels can have a huge impact as well. So those are 2 things I would throw into the mix.
Fantastic. All right, Farah, any additional thoughts on small changes with big impact?
Yeah, I mean, these are great comments from my panelists here. I'm trying to think of what to add. I mean, just building on some of the things that Ariana and Carly were saying, as you make time to reflect and assess how you're doing, a common question I recommend people just take the time to ask is there anything I should start, stop, or test? Because again, just because you've always been doing it doesn't mean you should keep doing it. And there's a million things out there that you could be spending your time. Small experiments, small steps can go a long way. You don't have to take it all on. If you're not sure if you should do A or B, just try it. Give yourself a moment, maybe a quarter, to see what happens. So I think allowing that room for experimentation and saying no is really important. And then, just zooming all the way out, I would just say periodically making time to go back to your goals and objectives. What's our mission? What does our strategic plan say that we're supposed to be doing over the next 3, 5, 10 years? And are our comms actually in service of that? Or have we gotten pulled into other directions because of one fire or another? Which is happened and is natural. But if we're looking to better use our time and our human resources, our financial resources, that strategic plan, that mission, that theory of change, that's meant to be our North Star. And sometimes, if we haven't looked at it in a while, if it's not alive, it's worth every 3 months, 6 months, just pausing, rereading it, just being like, are we doing stuff that's laddering up to that? Certainly, obviously, those who have strategic plans that are not iterative or situational or iterative, they may have created a plan in 2019 that certainly had to be changed in 2020. So of course you can't just look at the strategic plan unchallenged, but I do think just saying, not only are we being effective with our audiences in a day-to-day way, but again, are we doing everything we can to advance our mission?
Definitely. Thank you so much, Farah. All right, this is the last of my questions before opening it up to our wonderful audience. I've seen a few questions have already come in, and we have some from registration as well. But before I open that door, I want to sneak in my final question. And Farah, I'm actually going to stick with you for this one. I think we'd rather all learn from other people's mistakes rather than have to make them ourselves. What missteps have you seen nonprofits make, and how can the professionals on the call avoid these?
Well, my number one pet peeve, which I think is a mistake also, is when people list the general public as an audience. Unless you're running for president, or perhaps there may be a few other situations I can be challenged with, most of our organizations do not need to reach everyone out there. So who are the people that really need to know who we are, that we should be connecting to, that we should matter to, that should matter to us? Identifying those audience priorities and then making decisions based on who those folks are, and not just doing things because everyone else is, or because we read this article, or because a board member said we had to. Really coming back to who are those most important people that we should be engaging with, and clarifying and using those priorities. And if the general public is written down as a communications audience, please delete it as soon as possible.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Farah. All right, Daria, over to you. What mistakes have you seen nonprofits make to their marketing, and what should we avoid?
Oh, goodness. I was going to jump on Farrah's bandwagon about the general audience and media. I know it's controversial, but media is a conduit to reaching your audiences. I know some people go on either side of that wall, but that's another one for me. But other things, I think not taking an integrated approach to your communication strategy. It's going to lead to a lot of challenges down the line. When I was in-house, oftentimes I heard comments like communications, like, can you just give me a press release? And comms, as we all know on this panel, is not just about press releases, right? The work begins way before you get to the press release. And so I think if you're only using one avenue to get your messages out there, really, really start to think more about how can you broaden your reach using different strategies, because that is the name of the game now. And so I really just wanted to just flag that again. I think we've talked about it a little bit earlier, but an integrated approach is really the best approach to reaching your audiences. And it does take time. I know a lot of us are up against EDs that want things right away, wants that New York Times story tomorrow, wants to see, 20,000 new followers in the next 2 weeks. And I think the reality is you have to also manage expectations internally, oftentimes. And that's a lot of work sometimes, right? Especially if folks are not coming from a communications background. So I think it's spending time really managing expectations in a thoughtful way and being very strategic about an integrated approach to how you do communications.
Thanks, Daria. Ariana, you're up next. What are some pitfalls that nonprofits should avoid in their marketing efforts?
So many good ones said here. I would say one that comes up often is when building and especially a digital marketing strategy for the first time, expecting a financial return are expecting an ROI in terms of donations in the short term can often be a pitfall. And if that leads to discouragement, especially from the board or other stakeholders, and then you give up on it altogether because it didn't create a return in the short term, now you're not actually putting in the inputs needed to build a lasting relationship with your community over the long term. And so that's where, analytics are important, and painting a picture of what your audience is doing is important beyond just ROI, so that other stakeholders who are not as comms minded or digital marketing savvy can still understand what the return is, even if it's not dollars right away. And I think recognizing that it is a long journey to have a reliable donation stream from digital efforts, and it's going to continue changing. It's always going to be a moving target as your audience evolves, and being able to tell that story more to stakeholders and to understand more of what is happening beyond just the financial return.
Thanks, Ariana. And finally, Carly, any additional thoughts on common marketing mistakes and how to avoid them?
Sure. I would just say to go further on what Daria said earlier, having the program's staff aware of all the things that you are pushing out on the marketing side and communication side and vice versa is just so important. I have actually had an experience where I was planning a gala and it was that night, and somebody on my program's team was like, "Oh, what are you doing tonight?" And I was like, "I have been working so hard to make sure everybody knows about this event, and you didn't even know it was tonight." There's just a lack of communication and understanding of what everyone's doing in their departments. And that's such a potential downfall, because if somebody had asked them what our organization was doing for our fall fundraiser, they wouldn't know. And that would be very hard to know that they didn't share that message with them. So really just getting everyone on the same page and really genuinely being interested in each other's departments and making sure that you understand what your colleagues are doing, because they're working just as hard as you. It's very, very important.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Carly. All right, we're officially opening our Q&A portion. So let's start off with an audience question. And Carly, someone from the audience asked, what suggestions do you have for easily collecting community generated content?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. I actually work for MemoryFox, and that is a tech platform that helps you do that exact thing. So you're welcome. If you want to learn more about that, go to memoryfox.io. But just in general, I think the best way to collect community generated content is to make sure that the user, or that the person who's going to be telling their story, is able to do it on their own device, in their comfort of their own home, set up around the things that they feel comfortable around, because that's how you're going to get the authentic story from people and the full story in the way that they want it to be told.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Anything else? Anyone else want to add? All right, let's go ahead and move on to our next question. And Farah, someone from the audience asked, with a small team, what marketing or comms task can be outsourced to an agency, and which should you really consider keeping in-house? Can an agency ever replace an in-house person?
I do see organizations building their in-house teams more and more these days, and I'm really in favor of that. And I think we always want to come in and be additive and be most value. And I think, of course, believe that the in-house resources should be developed. That said, there are a lot of specialty skills out there and knowledge. And if you can only afford to have so many folks full-time in-house, sometimes bringing in specialist agencies to either do a very immediate function like managing and buying Google ads or social ads, or doing your PR and outreach for someone who already has relationships with the media on the topic area you work in, or somebody to build your brand, which is a place we come in a lot, who can provide that outside perspective, bring in that expertise, but work with your team to co-create things. I do think it can help and be additive. But again, I think the best agency relationships are ones that are done in partnership, and ones that are done where you're also building skills of that in-house team so they can do more and more on their own and not be as reliant on the agency potentially for forever.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Farah. Daria, anything else you want to add? Otherwise, I'll have you start us off with the next question.
I was just going to say, yeah, I totally agree with what Farah just shared. I think it really just depends on need and internal capacity to a certain extent. I've seen it done both ways, where agencies brought in to help really create the strategy, develop the messaging, right? Because sometimes you can't get out of your own head when everything is done in house. Sometimes just bringing in different voices, different brains to the project can be helpful in that way, and then passing the buck over to the in-house team to sort of execute. And I've seen it where an organization comes and they have a pretty good strategy. They're moving and grooving, and they just need extra hands on deck, to help execute or to help manage, an online social media community, or to Farah's point, to come in to really run with a paid media strategy, which is a bit more complicated and very much an area of expertise. So it just really depends on capacity and need. And I think either way, to Farah's point, if it's a really strong partnership, and you're laying out the need very clearly from the beginning, it can work either way.
Wonderful addition, Daria. Thank you so much. All right, Ariana. Here's an audience question. Social has become more and more a paid platform where organic content often earns little or reach engagement. Any suggestions on how to break through the algorithmic challenges with dynamic organic content?
Yeah, great question. First, I will always say this is that continuing to try to build your email list so that you have control over the messages and are not relying on the algorithms is key. Now, I also realize if you're trying to reach new folks, it can be hard to do that if they're truly brand new. So I think beyond building your email list, I think also exploring different formats. The original organic feeds do not have as much reach. Facebook feed or even just Instagram feed is not going to be prioritized, but other formats like stories or reels are heavily prioritized because these platforms, social platforms, they want users to use them and they want them to be adopted. And so it's keeping a pulse on that, and that's changing like every 6 months or so of like, what are those formats that are being actively prioritized by Instagram, Facebook, etc. So that plus building your email list in any way possible, lead generation campaigns. If you are going to do paid, I think lead generation campaigns on Facebook and on Instagram are also prioritized. And so having control over the messages and the channel, I think, is always going to be the best move to create more resilient organization.
Thanks, Ariana. Carly, anything else you want to add to that? Otherwise, I'll have you start us off the next question.
Yeah, sure. I would just add to that I completely agree. And then also just taking it one step further, once you do get them on your email list or you get them to follow you on socials, just make sure that content is dynamic and really fun to read and watch and listen to, because otherwise you're going to lose them just as fast as you gained them. So you want to just make sure that you're keeping them in and not going back to like that boring messaging. Just make sure you keep it fun and informative, of course, but yeah, have that personality.
Wonderful. I'll actually stick with you with this registration question. How can we best share the mission or message internally so staff becomes advocates and everyone is on the same page?
Wow. Yeah. Building a culture of storytelling and philanthropy at your organization can be challenging. And actually, we see this at a lot of organizations. My organization actually just went through a whole branding discussion, and we had a long brainstorm about what types of definitions we want to start using externally, internally, so we're all on the same page. And we all worked together really well, and we finally agreed on something. And then that way, we all have ownership over it. So I would say meet with your team, maybe come with some ideas, but really listen to them. How do they like to talk about your organization? What makes sense to them? Maybe what do they find resonates with people when they talk about your organization? And then everybody can get on the same page. I will say just a little bit on the flip side of that, every single elevator pitch cannot be exactly the same. It's just not going to sound the same from everybody. So as long as you get on board with those like similar definitions of like for us, it's community generated content, for example, you can take it from there with your little bit of elevator pitch. And as long as you practice again, make sure it sounds natural coming out of your mouth, maybe practice in the car, practice while you're getting ready in the morning, definitely out loud. That way you don't sound like, or you don't feel like you sound strange when you're saying it to a person for the first time because you've already said it 1,000 times.
I just would love to jump in here in terms of getting the messaging to stick and to be used. We have for the past several years been making digital brand guides. So once you've agreed on all that messaging, like Carly said, and you've done some practicing, make sure things are widely available. First of all, put messaging in your brand guide. It should be not, a lot of brand guides are just the logo, the typefaces or the fonts, the color palettes. That's all great. And you should make sure if you've got brand strategy that's in there or communication strategy, you have your messaging in there. And when you make it available digitally, first of all, hopefully, people aren't just relying on the comms person to get back to them. It's there for everyone to use at any time of day. And also you can update it. It's not a PDF that gets updated or is hard to update because the one person who's in design isn't in the office, whatever it may be. So just making those tools available and keeping them, somewhere people can access at all times.
I love that. I'm going to really quickly hop in and just say, at Fenton, we're also creating a DEI style guide. I also chair our DEI task force. And in addition to just your mission and vision and your organizational messaging, how do you want to talk about the work that you do, the broader work that you do, or the communities that you serve, right? Because that's something that's going to come up time and time again. And having some level of consistency in your guide around how do you address and speak about certain communities is going to be also a really helpful tool, I think, for all of us. And to Carly and Farah's point, it'll evolve over time as language changes quite frequently. But I think having that go-to guide for folks is a good starting point. And then holding maybe quarterly workshops with the internal team to keep working on this, right? Because for some, it's very natural. And then for others, that's me. It might take a while to stick. So keep working at it as well.
Thank you so much, Daria. Ariana, here's the next question. What is the best way to reach out to new community members and donor prospects?
I never want to say there is a best way. There are a few recommendations I have, but it really does depend on where you're at as an organization. I think something that is often overlooked is nurturing the attendees at events. So whether that they came to a fun run or they came to a seasonal small event and maybe they're just getting looped into the master email list, being able to actually segment out event attendees through community outreach and being able to nurture them with targeted specific messages, I think is a fantastic way because they've already connected in person with your organization, with a human. They put effort or time, and not letting those just fall by the wayside, but really developing a strategy with attendees. And then separately, there's so many different tools now for what we call cold targeting on display, on Facebook, on Google, and they're all very interesting, and I recommend A, B, C, D, E testing them. And really side by side, doing a test, and it doesn't have to be expensive. It's a kind of a paid advertising approach in the spirit of experimentation. But if you run a test with $20 to $50 each for a campaign over a couple weeks and just see the engagement. You're not trying to necessarily get donations. You're not trying to get email signups yet. Just see how many of those folks clicked and engaged with your ad, and then you can double down on the top performers. And so something we always recommend with new customers is you say that we have a lot of these potential new donor profiles. Let's actually put that to the test, and let's do an A/B test and see where that engagement is. So I don't know if there's a specific channel that is best. It's just testing different channels with small budgets or not an outsized amount of effort, and then you can iterate over time and double down on what is working. And that's how you're going to really be able to focus your time and energy.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Ariana. Unbelievably, the hour is going by so quickly. So, we're going to wrap up this portion of the panel so we can stick to our schedule. I've had such a wonderful time hearing from our panelists today, and I'm hoping to get one final piece of insight from all of them. And, Carly, I'll have you start us off. What do you see as the future of nonprofit marketing, and how can nonprofits get ahead today?
Sure. Well, I just want to say, in terms of this question, I definitely don't have all the answers. I can't tell you what the future is, but I will say, and I know this sounds really cliche, but please just don't stop learning. Take time to do professional development. Maybe you purchased a marketing book and it's sitting on that shelf and you've just never read it. Please pick it up and read it. Maybe you see a webinar come across your newsfeed and you think, oh, that sounds interesting, but I don't think I'll have time for it. Make time for it, or listen to a podcast episode. I love the We Are for Good podcast personally. They always have great people on there with all these fun, innovative ideas that just get you brainstorming and just thinking about new stuff. So I just really recommend, like, please don't stop learning. Don't try not to get too stuck into doing the day-to-day and doing the same things you've always done, because as we've all mentioned several times today, things are changing so fast, and it's just, you're going to feel more inspired and more just ready to come to work every day and be effective every day if you feel like you are constantly learning and just trying new things.
Thanks, Carly. All right, Ariana, thoughts on the future and how to get ahead today?
Because we have data more than we ever had, I think embracing experimentation over perfection is going to be the future. We, do not know what the perfect messaging strategy is going to be, and even if it is perfect now, it's not going to be with the next generation. And so, continuing to embrace the small ways to experiment and understand your audience and learn through paid ad tests, through continuing to revisit who your current donors are and the size of those donations, or who is engaging with different communities, revisiting ideally on an annual basis, but even quarterly, like, who are these different groups? What are your assumptions, and how you can continue improving how you reach those different audience groups so that in ways that resonates, versus having one central messaging strategy for everybody.
Thanks, Ariana. Farah, what do you see as the future and how to get ahead?
I wish I had a crystal ball. I'm going to speak to the second part of this question. I mean, I think the future is now, and I think Daria mentioned it, maybe one of the first things she said about, technology and AI and ChatGPT and all of that. I want to focus more on how you keep up with it and really second the learning, experimentation. I want to shout out a group called N10, the Nonprofit Technology Network, nten.org. I just came from their annual conference, which was awesome. And that's a great place to go to see how nonprofits are using comms, fundraising, tech to engage with their community. The other tip I would share is just, keep an eye on what your peers and partners are doing. Organizations like yours are also trying to ask and answer these same questions. And a lot of times your peers are happy to chat with you. But in the meantime, follow them on social, get on their email list, make a $5 donation, see what they're putting out there and where they're spending time, just to see, because your audiences are also probably engaging with them. So even just understanding what's happening in your space can help you, even if you're not getting ahead, just kind of staying with, I think, is also important.
Thanks, Farah. All right, Daria, thoughts on the future of nonprofit marketing and how to get ahead today?
Wow, I love all of those. Those are great answers. I think I would just build on by saying investing in your staff. I think a lot of nonprofits, because they're so community facing, may think that DEI is something that they naturally always do. And what I find is that there's a lot of more work that needs to go into that for nonprofits, bias training and asset versus deficit language, and sort of thinking about all those different pieces that really require investment and development. And I agree that coalition building, the issues that we are facing as a country are huge. And I think coalition building, to Farah's point, is another big approach that nonprofits should continue to do and explore and develop, because we're all in it together.
Thanks, Daria. All right. And with that, we have reached the end of our panel. I want to give a big thank you to our panelists for sharing their insights today. Also, want to give a big thank you to our audience. Thank you so much for your time. Hope you enjoyed yourself and learned something that will benefit the work that you do on a daily basis. We do have a packed spring and summer of panels ahead of us, and I hope that you will join us for them. We will have more panels on fundraising, fundraising best practices, financial best practices, engagement strategies, and so much more. So keep an eye out on the NXUnite website or the NXUnite LinkedIn page so you don't miss out on any of these. Also, if you're already taking time to join us, I highly recommend that you create a free NXUnite account. That way, you can begin earning what we call cost coins, which can be redeemed for discounts on industry software and consultations with some of our friends in the industry. All right, that is it for me. Once again, thank you all for joining us and have a nice rest of your day. Bye.